I appreciate that, but we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. But before we do that, Alec, why don't you cue up that video for us? I just want to give one last invitation to you about an event that's coming up this weekend.
On behalf of all the men and women of One Christ, One City that have sponsored this event coming up on March 26th, we invite you to join us. We'll be at the beautiful campus of Christ Venice at 8 o'clock for breakfast, and then at 9 o'clock the session starts, and we will have some wonderful worship and speakers. Our worship leader will be Pastor Mike Hudson of Christ Venice, and he'll be welcoming all. And then we have an exciting speaker, Jennifer Spear, founder of Word of Joy Ministry and author of Women of Grace, will be the first speaker talking about love and legacy. Then we have the amazing Pastor Chris Romig of Venice Presbyterian. For 18 years he's been leading that church, and he has a wonderful message on legacy, and it's not too late to build a spiritual legacy. And this Love and Legacy event is about taking your faith and sharing it with your future generations. I know many of you have been praying for your children and grandchildren to find Christ and live a life dedicated to Him. And this is your opportunity to come along on March 26th and make a difference for your future generations. And I will be closing the event speaking about how to do it. We will actually give you all the materials free for you to use so that you can produce a wonderful legacy for the kids and children following you. So please be our guest. You can text 223-1771 if you would like to come. It's a free event. You can sign up at your church, or you can text that you're coming. It's open to all men and women of the area. Be ready to make a difference and impact your future generation.
9 a.m. is when it begins, the worship begins. 8 a.m., they're just having like a continental breakfast. And if you haven't already signed up, you can email me or call the church tomorrow. Even if you don't sign up, if you're not sure you're free and Saturday morning you feel compelled or God speaks to you to come, show up anyway. It's a free event. It's just mainly to help with how much food they're going to have for breakfast and all that kind of stuff. But you know, I was honored to be asked to be part of this. There's so many great pastors and teachers in our community, but I really think this is so important for us to reflect on. You know, we can be going to all the Bible studies we want, and we can be going to church every Sunday, but what legacy are we going to leave behind us? And so I'm really looking forward to what Jennifer Spear is going to teach. Jim Fobister is going to give everyone a little resource, a book you can take home just to do some reflection for yourself. And this could spin off into other things, other ideas that we might even just have within our own church of helping folks think about how they share their stories. And I'm going to be talking about it's never too late. Yeah. So anyway, well, here we are. Welcome to those of you online. This will be our last study for the season. We're going to be halfway through Genesis, and at some point we will pick up the rest of Genesis. But I will be away for a couple weeks and then doing some traveling in May. So I just kind of figured, you know, rather than skipping weeks here and there, let's just take a break now, and probably sometime this summer we'll pick up with the rest of Genesis, whether it's in a Bible study format or through our messages on Sunday. You know, we'll kind of wait to see what takes shape there. But we've made a lot of progress getting through Genesis, and tonight we conclude the life of Abraham. And let me offer a prayer for us as we begin. Lord, thank you for your word, which has been handed down to us. Thank you for the way it speaks into our life. May it speak into my life and each of our lives tonight. In whatever way you would most want us to receive that message from you. Lord, just keep inspiring us to stay close to you, to stay close to your word. We pray in the name of Abraham's Lord and the God we know in Jesus Christ in fullness. Amen. Well, I do want to pick up at the end of Genesis 22. Genesis 22, of course, is the epic chapter. We looked at it last week of Isaac and his dad, Abraham, going to Mount Moriah. I'll be preaching on that this coming Sunday. But after that amazing story, we have this short little passage of 4 verses that end Genesis 22, and it almost seems like it's kind of jarring. It comes out of nowhere. Again, after we've had this emotionally charged account of Abraham and Isaac and God providing the ram, and then we're told about Abraham's relatives. What's going on here at the end of chapter 22? Well, some would argue that what this is doing is it's forming what's known as an inclusio over the whole Abraham story. Remember, Abraham's story was introduced back in Genesis 11 with the account of the generations of Terah, Abraham's father. And it talked about Terah was the father of Abraham, 3 sons, Abraham, Haran, and Nahor. And then for the next 13 chapters, then we have a concentration on Abraham. Well, here at the end of what I would argue is the climax of Abraham's story, the story on Mount Moriah, we have a return back to Terah's family. We had heard about Abraham and his branch of the family. You remember Abraham's brother Haran died, and Haran was the father of Lot. That's why Lot went with Abraham. But there was another son in the family named Nahor. And here we're reminded, Abraham is told, we don't know how he found this out, but behold, Milcah has also borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz, his firstborn, Buz, his brother, don't you love it? Uz was the brother of Buz. Kemuel, and then all these kids are named. But then notice in verse 23, it says Bethuel, who was the last one named of the children of Nahor and Milcah, Bethuel fathered Rebekah. So this little section here at the end of chapter 22 may be a sort of back bookend to the whole Abraham saga in a sense, but it's also the front bookend to what's going to follow. Because right here we're being introduced to Rebekah, who, spoiler alert, is going to be the wife of the promised son Isaac. Now, all of the readers, when Moses first wrote this down, would have been aware of that. So this is sort of the way that we're building a bridge here to the next part of the story. So then we come to chapter 23. And chapter 23 begins by telling us about the end of Sarah's life. And she lived a good long life, 127 years. And we have 2 verses here at the beginning of chapter 3 that describe Sarah's death and tenderly describe Abraham's mourning for his wife. It says in verse 2 that Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. That's just a touching little detail we have there. Think about how long Abraham and Sarah probably were married. If the average person got married somewhere between, well, we don't know, but I'm going to just guess 20 to 40, it's possible they were married 100 years or more, or at least 80 years. That's a long time to be with someone, and they certainly had their ups and their downs over the years. And you wonder what was going through Abraham's mind as he mourned and wept for his wife, the experiences they had shared, the ways that they had probably had their arguments. But it's just a tender detail about Abraham, this great patriarch, weeping and mourning for Sarah, and it reminds us that there is nothing wrong with weeping and mourning. Abraham, this manly patriarch, weeping and mourning for someone he loved. Don't think that to weep or to mourn reflects a lack of faith. Sometimes I hear people say that. That if I'm going to, I don't want to cry at this funeral because what will it say about my faith in the resurrection? Well, Jesus wept when his friend Lazarus died, even though Jesus certainly knew that God was the God of resurrection. And why would Jesus weep at the grave of Lazarus? Because it tells us in John chapter 11 that because he loved him. And when you love someone and they're gone, you miss them. And that's grief. It's part of being human. So we have that tender detail of Abraham's mourning here. But really, the focus of chapter 23 is not Sarah's death or Abraham's grief. The focus of chapter 23, that takes up the bulk of the verses here, is about Abraham buying a plot of land to bury Sarah there. And so the rest of chapter 23 involves Abraham going to the Hittites, who were probably different from another group that was known as the Hittites in the ancient world. There's a lot of commentaries written on that one, but we won't go into all that depth tonight. But it's an interesting conversation that reflects the typical bargaining process of the Middle East. First, Abraham comes to them and he acknowledges, note at the beginning, verse 4, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. So Abraham, even at the age of 137, which he is at this point, he's been in the promised land for roughly 62 years at this point. But he's still a foreigner and a sojourner. He's a respected man in the region, but he still doesn't own any land. And he had moved all the way from Mesopotamia to come here because God was promising land to him and his descendants, but he's still a squatter, a resident alien in the place. And so he's coming to beg for some place to bury his wife. He says, give me property. Some of your translations may say, give me possession, which is actually even a better use of the Hebrew word there. Give me possession among you for a burying place that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, hear us, my Lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Hospitality, which is a key characteristic of the Middle East. They're being hospitable to him. Now, this is sort of a game they're playing here. No one's going to give Abraham this land, but they're wanting to present themselves as hospitable people. So then Abraham comes back. He bows before them. He says, he specifically asked for a particular cave that belongs to Ephron, the son of Zohar, the cave of Machpelah, which means double cave or split cave. And Abraham says in verse 9, for the full price, let him give it to me in your presence, property for a burying place. In proper negotiations, you're always going to offer a fair price. But Abraham here is offering a full price, in part because a full price ensures that a deal will be irrevocable. If you're sold something at a discount, down the road, some descendant of the person who sold the property will say, well, you didn't pay fair price for it. You didn't pay full price for it. So they'll put in a claim for it. There's all this kind of behind-the-scenes stuff you need to be aware of here that's going on in these negotiations. And Abraham says, please ask Ephron if I can pay full price. And Ephron's sitting right there among the people. And so he responds himself and says, no, my Lord, verse 11, hear me, I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. Now, we might think, wow, what a great deal. I'll take it. But no, in this formality of the way that bargaining happened, Abraham comes back and says, no, no, no. And remember, earlier in chapter 14, he said he wouldn't take something that was given to him. Abraham wants to make really clear that anything that he has is fairly and squarely and legitimately his. And so he offers back. He says, I will give you full price. And then Ephron comes back, verse 15, and notice his response. My Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. So once again, he's kind of making this sort of presentation that, oh, we'll work something out that I'm going to be gracious to you. But he drops this number that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to us, 400 shekels of silver. But this is, for all we know, a very exorbitant amount. Now, of course, we don't know exactly how inflation and things changed over the centuries. But what we do know from ancient sources is the average laborer in that part of the world in those days got about 10 shekels of silver a year. So this is 40 years of wages that is put on the value of this field. And we know that, later David purchased the whole area where the temple would be built in Jerusalem for 50 shekels of silver. On the eve of the Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah bought a field, Anatoth, for 17 shekels of silver. So here, Ephron is presenting a deal he couldn't refuse, 400 shekels. And what does Abraham do? Verse 16, Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighted out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver. And you see the detail of even how the merchants are weighing it out. It's just kind of a neat little detailed picture into the world of ancient business. So that is where Sarah's body was buried, there in that field of Ephron in Pela, with that cave. It says it was made over or deeded to Abraham as a possession. And the chapter ends by just reminding us that that field and that cave were deeded to Abraham as property for a burying place. So, here at the end of Sarah's life, and I think this is the real focus of chapter 23, kind of tying some things up in this. I sort of see 23, 24, and 25 as sort of postscript to the Abraham saga. And chapter 23, what we have here that points forward to is finally Abraham has a piece of the promised land. It may just be a very small piece, but he's got the piece of the promised land there. He will be buried there in that same cave. Isaac and Rebekah will be buried in that cave. Jacob and his wife Leah will be buried in that cave. And over the centuries, that cave became one of the most revered sites of the Jewish people. It still is, even though now a mosque covers that site, because remember, the Muslim people also see Abraham as their father in the faith. In fact, the name of the mosque there is called Haram el-Khalil, which means the sacred place of the friend of God. So even in the Islamic tradition, Abraham is known as a friend of God. But Abraham finally has a piece of the land that God has promised. And then chapter 24 is actually the longest chapter in all of the book of Genesis, 67 verses. I don't know how many of you had a chance to read over chapter 24 before, but it is a wonderful story, which again ties up another kind of loose end. Remember, the promise was made through Abraham's son Isaac. Well, Isaac's got to have descendants, right? I mean, it's great that Abraham and Sarah had a son in their old age, but what if that son never has any descendants? Well, chapter 24 begins with Abraham saying to his trusted servant, we need to find a bride for Isaac. Isaac was 37 years old when his mother died. We later find out he's 40 when he marries Rebekah. So this is right shortly after Sarah has died. So Abraham says to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. A couple things. This servant is never named in Genesis 24. Many people reading the Bible have always wondered, is this Eleazar, who was mentioned back in chapter 15 as the one who initially, remember, Abraham thought would be the one to inherit all of his stuff. And the fact that we get this description of this oldest servant in Abraham's house who had been with him all these years, it may very well be the same Eleazar who has been his trusted servant all the years. We don't know because, again, he's not named here in chapter 24. But you see, there's this dilemma. Isaac needs a wife, but as Abraham says, he must not marry a Canaanite. Why must he not marry a Canaanite? Well, I think the reason he must not marry a Canaanite is, it's not that by going back to Mesopotamia, he's going to marry someone who's a believer, because remember, Abraham's family back there were people who worship many gods, including the moon god. So it's not a matter of marrying someone who's in the faith. I think it has more to do with the fact that it's wanting to make sure that Abraham and his people remain distinct within this new land, and so that down generations to come, people, particularly, remember, Moses is writing this down for the people as they're going through the Exodus, making very clear the people they will encounter in Canaan, they're not relatives at all. So Isaac cannot marry someone from Canaan, but at the same time, Abraham will later say to his servant, don't take Isaac with you. Isaac's got to stay here. Why is that? Well, I think it's because Abraham knows, number one, that their place in that land is still very tenuous. So it's important for Isaac to remain there. By the way, Abraham, of course, is very old at this point, too, so he probably wants his son there in case something happens to him. But also, Abraham may know that if Isaac goes back to to Mesopotamia, he may not get him back. God has called them out of to the new land, the promised land. And so Isaac's going to stay back. Abraham's going to send his servant. This business about putting your hand under my thigh, a lot of volumes have been written about that. We don't really know what it means. It's just some sort of ancient type of making an oath, way that they made oaths in those days. But just to signify the solemnity of this, that this is going to be a very special promise that Abraham's entrusting his servant with. So the servant, Eleazar, or if it may not be Eleazar, this unnamed servant, verse 10 tells us that he took 10 of his master's camels and departed. So he's taking all of these camels to, why does one servant need 10 camels? Well, it's remember, when you're looking for a bride, there's a price to pay. And whether he's going to pay with those camels or at least signify to the father of the bride that the person who's interested in making this transaction has the means to do it. I think that's part of what's going on here. But there's also a foreshadowing there with these 10 camels, and we'll get into that because so the servant makes this long journey all the way back to Mesopotamia, about 500 miles. And then when he arrives, verse 11, he made the camels kneel down by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And then notice verses 12 through 14. Because one of the things about this chapter is when you read it, you see the unseen presence of God throughout. I mean, God never says anything directly in chapter 24, but the Lord, L-O-R-D, all capitals, the name of the Lord, is mentioned 17 times in this chapter. And here you see with verse 12, the servant prays when he arrives at that well. O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who will say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you've appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. This is the first instance in the whole Bible of someone praying, or at least a recorded instance, of someone praying for specific guidance. And he's actually asking God for a sign. God, help me know that I'm in your will. So this is so beautiful because he's not just going out and using his own strategy to say, well, I'm going to sit by this well and see who looks really pretty, or even see who seems to have a nice attitude about him. No, he's relying on God to reveal the answer. And he says, God, let this be the one who not only offers water to me, but who offers water for my camels to drink. Now, as I was preparing for our study tonight, I learned something that I never had known before. Did you know that a camel, if it hasn't gone with water for a couple days, will typically drink up to 25 gallons of water? Did you know that a typical jar in the ancient Near East, the ones they carried, even the big jars, they carried about 3 gallons of water? How many camels do we have here? 10. So that's 250 gallons of water needed to satisfy these thirsty camels. And so if Rebecca has a 3-gallon jar, that means that she or whoever this woman is going to be making 80 or more trips to the well, back and forth to give water to these camels. This is quite an audacious sign the servant is asking for. I mean, if you really are taking it at its value of what realistically these camels are going to drink, someone to offer that is going way beyond what a servant's heart would typically offer. But what happens? Look at verse 15. Before he had finished speaking, behold, and here the narrator gives us some information that the servant doesn't know. Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, remember the end of chapter 22, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. The young woman, verse 16, was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. That's an important detail to let us know that, she's perfectly chaste. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. And the servant ran down to meet her and said, please give me a little water to drink from your jar. By the way, this would have been very common at the ancient wells, and we see this even in Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well in Samaria. It's typical that women would come to water their jars at different parts of the day, usually during the cool of the day. Interestingly, Jesus meets a woman at the hot part of the day, but usually it happened in the morning or in the evening or late afternoon. And it was typical, again, the hospitality of the ancient Near East. If there were a visitor, you would always offer the visitor a cup of water or something like that. So that's not surprising that he would approach her and she would say, "Drink, my Lord." And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. Verse 19, when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking." So, and notice the details were given. She quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well. She ran to draw her water, and she drew for all his camels. The man, I love this sentence, gazed at her in silence. Isn't that a great picture? Before he had finished praying, his prayers answered. And he just stands there this whole time, gazing at her. Not because she was beautiful, but gazing at her because God's beautiful. And he gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. So he still is kind of just waiting to see as she's going through this whole exercise of feeding the camels. And then he presents her with a gold ring and bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels. That's a very lavish gift to give to her. And then they have an exchange, and then he explains to her. Look at verse 26. She identifies who she is, and then he says, verse 26, he worshiped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who's not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman." Trusting the Lord to provide this answer to prayer. So then, if you look at chapter 24, it's really kind of 4 sections. The first section is Abraham's giving this commissioning to his servant. The second exchange is really between the servant and Rebekah when he meets her at the well. Now, the third and longest part of chapter 24 is going to be the interaction between the servant and Rebekah's family. So she runs home, and notice verse 30, as soon as her brother Laban saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms and heard the words of Rebekah his sister, "Thus the man spoke to me," he went to the man. He was excited. And that's an important detail we're given there. As soon as he saw the gold ring and the bracelets on her wrists, he was interested. Any of us would be, of course. But this is a foreshadowing about Laban. And when we come to more about him, because he will appear later in the Genesis story, and one thing you see about Laban is he is greedy. By the way, we also, our first picture of Rebekah, what do we learn about her? Yes, she's very hospitable, but she's also incredibly industrious and smart. And we'll see that play out as we get a picture of Rebekah in the rest of Genesis. And so this next section is all about basically the servant repeating what has already happened. So I won't go over all of that with you tonight, other than just to invite you again to look at how often the Lord is referenced in this chapter. He's giving glory to God. He's talking about God's goodness and blessing him. And then at the end of this sharing of the story, he then asks them, verse 49, "Now then, if you are going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may turn to the right hand or to the left." So the servant is obviously convinced God has done this miracle in bringing Isaac's cousin's daughter to the well in the way that he had asked the sign of the Lord. He's shared this. He's glorified God to all of Rebekah's family. And now he's just asking, do you give your blessing to this? And then verse 50, Laban, her brother, and Bethuel, this is the first time her father is mentioned here, or at least appears in the scene, answered and said, the thing has come from the Lord. So even if they may not be believers, when someone is telling them what God does, they're convinced, or at least they're intrigued. So we shouldn't ever be afraid of sharing what God has done in our lives to people. That's part of how we leave a legacy with people. Yes, telling them about the events that happen in our lives, but also telling them how God was weaving it all together. And even if folks may not be believers or churchgoers, hearing stories like that intrigues them. And in some cases may lead them to the Lord. And so they respond, they see this thing has come from the Lord. And so they say, Rebekah may go as the Lord has spoken. And so then there's just some more exchange between them. And her brother, verse 55, and her mother said, let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that, she may go. That's actually kind of a wise statement. I mean, think about it. I mean, yes, this guy has come showering her with gold bracelets and a gold earring, with 10 camels, talking about a prosperous man who's living 500 miles away. But it's a scary thing to send off your daughter, even to a relative. So they say, let's just keep her here for 10 days just so we can sit with this and think about it. But the servant responded, don't delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. So what the servant's thinking is, there's an old man back there in Canaan who's wanting to know what's happening. I don't know how much longer my old man has back there. I want to go back and tell him the good news immediately. So what do? They say, let us call the young woman and ask her. That's a stunning statement, because usually in these arranged marriages, a woman had no say in it whatsoever. So now, does Rebekah have any say over whether she wants to marry him? We don't know. But at least she's going to have some say in terms of whether she is going to go now or later. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And you see, for them to ask her, do you want to marry Isaac, that would almost be an unethical question, because they've basically already agreed to the terms of the marriage, the two families. So probably what the question is really asking is, will you go with this man now? And Rebekah said, short and sweet, I will go. So they sent her away with her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. Her nurse would have been her wet nurse who helped raise her. And she became, the sister that it refers to is, so they sent away Rebekah, their sister. So Laban sending away his sister and her nurse. So she would accompany the young woman she has helped to raise. And then they give her a blessing as she leaves. And then they return. They make this journey. And then the last section of this chapter is the bride and the groom meeting. And we alluded to this last week, how there's this beautiful picture of Isaac, who hasn't appeared since back on Mount Moriah. He's out in the field meditating. And in the distance, he sees the group arriving with his bride. And I've suggested that's a beautiful foreshadowing of Jesus, who offered himself as the perfect sacrifice for us, is waiting for his bride to come and be joined to him for all eternity, the church. And we have all that bridal imagery in the New Testament. Now, one detail I just want to point out lastly in chapter 24, where is Isaac returning from? Verse 62. Be'er lahai roi. And it will later say at the end of chapter 25, or in verse 11 of chapter 25, that that's where Isaac and Rebekah will settle, in Be'er lahai roi. All right. I wish I had some prize to give to the person who remembers what Be'er lahai roi, where we've heard that before. Go back to Genesis 16 and remember. You don't have to turn to it, but just remember in your memories. When the first time that Sarah and Abram sent Hagar out, she was in the wilderness and the angel of the Lord appeared to her and she named that place Be'er lahai roi, the well of the living one who sees me. And so here we have Isaac, the child of the promise, dwelling in the place where God had encountered Ishmael's mother. Just kind of an interesting detail there. That place that you might think had gotten forgotten when it was just named there in Genesis 16 comes back as the place where the son of the promise is actually going to dwell. Remembering that's where God had met Hagar. And finally, then we come to chapter 25. And it begins by telling us that Abraham took another wife whose name was Couture. And other places she's identified as a concubine. So was she a wife? Was she a concubine? A couple questions. First of all, a concubine was essentially a second-class wife. So when you hear that term in the Bible, that's what it means. It means someone who is taken into your household almost like a second-class wife. The man did not have to pay a dowry, any kind of a bridal price for her. A concubine had much fewer legal rights, but it was sort of a way of having another female companion, having someone who could bear children, even though those children may not have the same legal rights as an heir with a first-class wife, just part of that ancient Near East world. The other question we have is, when did Abraham take Keturah as his wife? There's some dispute over this. Some people say that because of where it's appearing chronologically in Genesis, it may be logical to think that Abraham at the age of 137 is taking another wife. I mean, he will still have 35 more years of life on earth. But the question is, could a man that old have fathered all these children who are listed in verses 2 and 3? And so that has led many to speculate that actually this is sort of referring to just one little remaining detail of Abraham's life that hadn't gotten covered before. And some suggest, many in fact suggest, that Abraham may have taken this concubine Keturah much earlier in his life. For instance, after Hagar, during that interim time between Ishmael's birth and Isaac's birth. We don't know. It's a mystery we're not sure of. But anyway, the point is that we're told that Abraham had all these other sons. But what chapter 25 is wanting, again, to tie up a loose end, it's saying Abraham had a bunch of sons. He had a bunch of sons to Keturah, his concubine. He had, we know, one son by Hagar, Ishmael, who will be referenced at the end of chapter 25. But while all of these sons were taken care of by their dad, all of the inheritance would really be given to the son of the promise, Isaac. And so that's sort of a declaration, really. That's sort of the point of chapter 25, I would argue, is to remind us that Isaac, in fact, it says, verse 5, Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. Yes, the sons of the concubines, verse 6, and that would, I think, include both the son of Couture and Hagar. Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. And by the way, the sons of Couture, some of these names, we can identify places in the ancient world where eventually they located. Like one name that will probably jump out at you is Midian. Midian is where Moses would go, and he met his wife, who was a Midianite, in Exodus chapter 2. The Midianites will all later become enemies of Israel in the land, but that's one name you'll certainly recognize there. And then verse 7, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. So remember, how old was Abraham when he moved to the promised land? 75. So how many years did he spend in the promised land, roughly? 100 years. Abraham spent a century in the promised land. Verse 8, he breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And that phrase, gathered to his people, may refer to some hints of what people in the Old Testament thought of in terms of life after death. That the idea was when you died, your soul was gathered with all of your ancestors in a place that was known as paradise, if you lived a good and righteous life. And in fact, when Jesus tells the story of Lazarus the beggar in the bosom of Abraham in Luke chapter 16, he's talking about Abraham being there in paradise. So that's probably what this is referring to. He was gathered to his people. There was no sense of like resurrection in the sense of a Christian sense of bodily resurrection, but there certainly was a sense of eternal life and hope for a final resurrection in ancient Judaism. And then verse 11 tells us that Isaac settled at that place, Beer Lahai Roi, tying in some of the threads of the story. And then really the story of Abraham then ends curiously with telling us about the generations of Ishmael. So Ishmael has not totally disappeared from the story. And I think what these last 6 verses, Genesis 25, verses 12 through 18, sort of tie up for us is just a reminder again of God's faithfulness to his promises. Because what we're told here, in addition to letting us know that Ishmael had 12 sons, remember in verse 16 it says he had 12 princes according to their tribes. Back in chapter 17, God said to Abraham, when Abraham was concerned about Ishmael, don't worry about Ishmael, he will be the father of 12 princes. And here's the fulfillment of that promise. Another promise is fulfilled here after it tells us about Ishmael's death. Verse 17, he lived 137 years. So he outlives his father by 48 years. He lived 48 years after Abraham died. It says he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. So that same formula. And then verse 18, they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria, and he settled over against all of his kinsmen. Back in chapter 16, God had said, the angel of the Lord had said to Hagar, your son will be antagonistic towards his relatives. And here we have sort of a fulfillment of that promise. He settled over against all of his kinsmen. And as we've talked about, many would point to Ishmael as the father of the Arab people. I mean, I've suggested that maybe that's not as pure as some would like to see, but certainly that has been a an understanding down through the centuries that Ishmael was the father of the Arab people. And even to this day, we still have the tensions between the descendants of Isaac, the Jewish people, and the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabic people, many of whom then became Muslim. So in some sense, some of the groundwork for even some of the disputes we have today is laid here in Genesis. So there's a beautiful detail I forgot to mention here in chapter 25 where it says in verse 9, Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried Abraham in the cave at Pela. So even though there was this tension between Isaac and Ishmael, beginning from Isaac's birth, they came together to bury their dad. I wonder what that meeting was like. I mean, Ishmael had to be jealous of Isaac. There had to be some resentment there, but yet they came together to bury their father. And I just think about God's promise, initial promise to Abraham, which was that he would bless Abraham's descendants, yes, but they would be a blessing to all the peoples of the world. That through Abraham's descendants, all the peoples of the world will be blessed. And I'd like to think that one day Isaac and Ishmael will come together again. Why? Well, because I think the descendants of both Isaac and Ishmael will realize how God has blessed the world through the descendants of Isaac, namely through Jesus Christ. And I just want to pray and believe that one day Jesus Christ will unite even Jews and Arabs together, recognizing that God is our shared Father and that Jesus is the one who brings us the peace, who is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. Is that too much to pray for? No. Because I think it's a promise of God that through the line of Isaac and through the ultimate Redeemer, Jesus Christ, that will bless all the nations of the world. And friends, when you hear about, it's interesting, our question and answer began with, how does God communicate to people? God's communicating to people in the Islamic world. You know, the nation where where Christianity is growing the fastest in the world today? Well, China by numbers, but in terms of by volume, it's Iran. I mean, you don't hear about it so much. I mean, certainly Al Jazeera is not promoting that on their broadcasts. But from people on the street and from believers who are there in Iran, they're telling us amazing things are happening. And I'd like to think that in my lifetime, the Middle East and the Arabic world is going to come under the lordship of Jesus Christ. I think we can pray for that. Not because we're superior or trying to impose a religion on anybody else. No, but because Jesus is the one who provides life. He's the perfect sacrifice. He's the one that frees us all from any sense of religious duty of having to earn our way to salvation. Jesus is the answer for the whole world. Not as an exclusive idea, but as an inclusive idea, to say that Jesus is the one who brings us peace. So, just some closing thoughts. Abraham, I think it's just so valuable to look at Abraham's journey of faith. In fact, it's really, in some ways, the most detailed journey of faith of any individual we have in all of the Bible. I mean, I guess you could argue that you look at David's life and maybe David would be on a comparison, but in terms of just getting the details of some of the events of a life in walking with God and trying to follow God's promises, there's no one who matches Abraham in all of the Bible. And that's why in Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham has more verses than anybody else. I mean, that whole Hall of Fame, Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11, Abraham is the shining character of it all. More verses about him. And as we've seen, his journey of faith had lots of ups and downs. I mean, he wobbled and tripped all along the way on his journey of faith, but he endured to the end and just continued to try to remain faithful. And he has this designation 3 times in the Bible, in Isaiah 41:8, 2 Chronicles 27, and James 2:23, all describe Abraham as the friend of God. Paul lifts up Abraham as a model of faith in Romans 4 and Galatians 3. And I think about Abraham and I think about me and you. We have greater promises, and we know greater promises and greater blessings than Abraham ever had. What do I mean? Well, we live on this side of Jesus. We've seen the cross, the glory of the cross. We've seen the resurrection of Jesus. We have the Holy Spirit who leads us and guides us and fills us and gives us good gifts. So, if Abraham could trust in God, why can't I? But here's the thing. Even though we have greater promises and greater blessings than Abraham ever knew in his life, we also still see, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, only see in part. And that's the reality of being human. That until Jesus returns, we're going to be living in this world that requires faith. To trust in things not seen. But like Abraham, as it says in Hebrews 11, having the faith to believe that God is preparing for us an ultimate destiny that far outweighs anything we can see and experience here. Like Abraham, we live and we die in faith, receiving in part in this life, but not yet receiving in full what God has promised. And so as we make this journey of faith ourselves, I think the thing we aspire to, even though we're not going to receive it all in this life, I think the thing we aspire to is to be that friend of God. Yes, Abraham's the one in the Bible who's identified as the friend of God, but Jesus said in John 15 to his disciples, and I think he's also speaking to us as his disciples today, I no longer call you servants. I call you, what does he say? Friends. So let's explore for the remainder of this Lenten season, and I hope for every day of our lives, what it means to be a friend of God. And to know that God's faithfulness, His promises are sure. To look forward, keep our eyes on the prize, the ultimate prize. But just savor every encounter with God along the way as friends of the Almighty. Bless you as we will let you know when we'll pick up the second half of Genesis, but thanks for journeying through Abraham's life of faith together.